The courtroom was silent. Not the kind of silence that felt peaceful, but the kind that carried the weight of something unresolved, something broken. Jack Carter sat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped tightly together. His once proud posture was now slightly slumped, weighed down by months of accusations, sleepless nights, and a trial that had turned his life into a spectacle. He could hear the murmurs in the crowd, police officers who once saluted him now, whispering behind his back. The man who had spent 15 years serving the force was now branded a traitor. But Jack didn't care about them. His eyes weren't on the jury or the judge. They were on the back of the room, where a single German shepherd sat rigid, his dark eyes locked onto him. Rex Jack swallowed hard. The air felt thick in his lungs. That dog wasn't just a K9 partner, he was family. They had been through hell together. Car chases, drug busts, nights where Jack had fallen asleep in his squad car with Rex curled up in the passenger seat. The dog had once trusted him with his life. And yet, now there was nothing in Rex's stare, no recognition, no warmth. Jack exhaled slowly. This was the hardest part, not the trial, not the false accusations, not even the betrayal of his own department. The hardest part was seeing his best friend look at him like a stranger. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "We will now proceed with the final witness." Jack's stomach tightened as the doors opened. A handler led Rex down the aisle. Each click of the dog's nails against the floor felt like a hammer against Jack's chest. What happened next? No one could have expected. 1 year earlier, the city of Brookhaven wasn't the kind of place that made national headlines. It was quiet, suburban, a place where people left their doors unlocked and trusted the badge. But that trust had shattered. The night Sergeant Jack Carter was arrested. It had been a sting operation, a warehouse near the docks. Jack had been the first through the door, with Rex at his side. Everything had happened fast. Flashes of gunfire, the shouts of officers, the distinct scent of gunpowder filling the air. And then, chaos. Somewhere in the confusion, shots had been fired that weren't in the official reports. A suspect had been found dead, executed, they said. The evidence? The gun had Jack's fingerprints. Jack had sworn he didn't do it. He screamed it at his captain, at his fellow officers, at anyone who would listen. But the department needed someone to blame. His badge was stripped from him, his gun taken, and Rex. Jack clenched his jaw at the memory. They had taken Rex from him that same night. Jack had barely managed to reach for the dog before the handler pulled him back. The last thing he saw was Rex straining against the leash, barking, fighting to reach him. Then, darkness. The bond that once was, before all of this, before the accusations and the trial, there had been just Jack and Rex. Jack had found Rex when he was just a puppy, abandoned behind the station. The dog had been small, scared, ribs showing through his fur. He wasn't the strongest or the biggest, but Jack had seen something in him, something fierce. "Give him a week," Jack had told the skeptical canine trainer. "I'll make him the best partner you've ever seen." And he had. Rex had saved lives. He had taken down armed criminals, sniffed out missing children, and once he had even thrown himself in front of a bullet meant for Jack. The bond they shared wasn't just professional, it was unbreakable. Or at least, that's what Jack had thought. The betrayal that cut deepest after his arrest. Jack had written letters to his captain, to his so-called friends on the force, but most of all, to Rex. He knew the dog couldn't read, but that didn't matter. It was the only thing keeping him sane. He'd write about his day in his small cold jail cell, about how he still woke up expecting to hear Rex's paws padding across the floor, about how the silence gnawed at him, but none of those letters ever reached their destination. And then, one day, he saw him. Jack had been taken to the courthouse for a preliminary hearing, handcuffed, shackled, treated like a criminal, and there, standing by a new handler, was Rex. The sight had nearly knocked the air from Jack's lungs. Jack had called his name. "Rex!" The German shepherd's ears had twitched, but then nothing. No bark, no tail wag, no recognition. It was like Jack was a ghost, and that's when Jack realized the truth. They had trained Rex to forget him, a courtroom. Unlike any other, Now, as Rex was led toward the witness stand, Jack could feel his heart pounding. He wasn't sure what was going to happen next. The prosecution had brought Rex in as evidence, proof that Jack was unfit, that even his own partner had turned on him. Jack wasn't even sure if Rex could remember him anymore. And then, something shifted. The handler gave a command. Rex obeyed, sitting at attention, staring straight ahead. But then, just for a second, his ears flicked. Jack inhaled sharply. He knew that flick, that hesitation. It was the same thing Rex had done every time Jack had called his name in the past. It was buried deep, but something was still there. Jack met the dog's gaze, willing him to remember. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, Rex's tail twitched. Jack barely breathed. The handler gave another command, this time sharper. Rex hesitated, and then, ever so slowly, the German Shepherd did something no one in that courtroom expected. He turned his head. He looked directly at Jack, and his eyes, those dark, intelligent eyes, widened. Jack didn't dare move, and then the unthinkable happened. With a single desperate whine, Rex lunged. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Gasps rippled through the spectators as Rex lunged forward, yanking so hard against his leash that his handler staggered. The judge pounded the key, gavel shouting for order, but no one was paying attention. Jack's breath caught in his throat. For the first time in nearly a year, Rex's eyes held something familiar. It wasn't just obedience or training. It was recognition. The German Shepherd whined, straining toward Jack, claws scraping against the polished courtroom floor. But before he could reach him, the handler recovered, yanking hard on the leash. "Control your dog," the judge barked. The handler struggled, gripping the leash with both hands. "He's never done this before. He's always followed commands." Jack felt a flicker of hope, but it was crushed just as fast. A sharp whistle cut through the air. Rex froze. His ears snapped back, his tail went stiff, and in an instant he stopped fighting. Jack's chest tightened as he watched Rex's body language change. It was like watching a soldier being pulled back into line. Whatever memories had surfaced, whatever instinct had told Rex to go to Jack, had been shut down in a heartbeat. The prosecution attorney smirked. "Your Honor, I believe this proves our point. This K9 has been retrained under a new handler and no longer associates with the defendant." Jack clenched his fists. His heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his skull. No. Rex had remembered. Him. For just a second he had fought against his training, but now he was back under control because someone had forced him to be. The realization made Jack's blood boil. They had brainwashed him. The system had taken everything. Jack barely heard the rest of the hearing, words blurred together. Legal. Terms, accusations, closing statements. It all faded into the background. His mind was stuck on what had just happened. Rex had recognized him, but something was stopping him from acting on it. Jack was shoved to his feet by the bailiff, his cuffs locking around his wrists once more. As he was led out of the courtroom, he dared one last look at Rex. The German Shepherd was sitting obediently at the handler's side, ears pinned back. His body was rigid, but his eyes told a different story. There was hesitation, doubt. Jack swallowed hard. He had to get through to him. But how? A prison sentence of silence. The days that followed were torture. Jack was taken back to his holding cell, the same 4 grey walls he had spent nearly a year trapped in. He lay on the hard cot, staring at the ceiling, replaying the courtroom scene over and over. He had seen it, Rex's moment of hesitation, the spark of memory. They hadn't erased him completely, but the system had worked fast. They had taken his badge, his reputation, his freedom. And now, they had taken his only real friend. Jack had once believed in justice, in the truth always coming to light, but now he wasn't so sure. The trial was nearing its end. If convicted, Jack could spend decades behind bars, and Rex, he'd be stuck, with a handler who saw him as just another tool, a weapon in uniform. The thought made Jack's fists tighten. He had to do something, a desperate attempt to reconnect. A week later, Jack was granted a short meeting with his attorney in a private room. The moment he sat down across from her, he leaned in, voice urgent. "Can you get me a visit with Rex?" His lawyer sighed. "Jack, that's not how this works. You're on trial. The police department controls Rex now. Even if I could arrange something..." "He remembered me." Jack's voice was raw. "In the courtroom, he fought to get to me." The attorney hesitated. "I saw." Jack's jaw clenched. "Then you know they've done something to him." She exhaled, tapping a pen against the table. "The K9 unit has protocols. When a dog is reassigned, they go through intensive retraining. They're taught new commands, new habits. It's meant to reprogram their loyalty." Jack's stomach. Twisted reprogram. They had turned Rex into a machine. "Please," Jack said, his voice quieter now. "Just find a way. Even if it's just 5 minutes." His attorney didn't answer right away. She studied him, then finally nodded. "I'll see what I can do." The meeting that broke him. A few days later, it happened. Jack was escorted into a secured police training facility, his wrists cuffed in front of him. He was led to an empty room, just a simple, sterile space with tiled floors and white walls. And then the door opened. Rex stepped inside. Jack barely breathed. The handler released the leash but stayed close, his hand hovering near the dog's collar. "He won't attack," the man said flatly. "He doesn't respond to you anymore." Jack ignored him. Slowly, carefully, he knelt down. "Hey, buddy," he whispered. Rex stood perfectly still. No wagging tail, no whine of excitement, just cold, unblinking obedience. Jack swallowed hard. He extended a hand, his fingers just inches away from Rex's snout. Nothing, no movement, no reaction. Jack tried again. "It's me, pal. It's Jack." The dog's ears twitched, just barely, but the rest of him stayed rigid. Jack's chest ached. He felt like someone had reached inside him and crushed something vital. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, frayed piece of cloth, the corner of his old police uniform, the one Rex used to chew on when he was a puppy. He placed it on the floor between them. Rex's nostrils flared. His eyes flicked down for a fraction of a second, and then he stepped back. Jack's heart cracked wide open. This was it. This was the moment he realized. Rex wasn't just trained to forget him. He had been trained to reject him. Jack felt his throat tighten. "They did this to you, didn't they?" he murmured. "They made you forget." Still, Rex didn't move. The handler smirked. "Told you. He's not your dog anymore." Jack clenched his fists. He wanted to scream, to punch something, to rip apart whoever had done this, but instead he exhaled, and he did something he hadn't done in years. He whistled. It was soft, barely audible. A two-tone whistle, the same one he had used every morning for years to call Rex to his side. The sound seemed to cut through the air like a blade. For a second, just a second, something flickered in Rex's eyes. But then he turned away. Jack felt like he had been gutted. The handler tugged the leash. "Let's go, boy." And just like that, Rex was gone. The breaking point back in his cell, Jack sat on the edge of his cot, his hands shaking. He had thought there was a chance. He had felt it. That moment where Rex almost remembered, but almost wasn't enough. His best friend had walked away from him. Jack Carter had lost everything, and for the first time in his life. He wasn't sure if he could ever get it back. A fight for freedom and the truth. Jack Carter had spent his life believing in justice, believing that if you were a good man, did the right thing, and stood by your brothers in uniform, the system would protect you. That belief had died the day they threw him behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. Now, as he sat in his cell, staring at the cracks in the concrete wall, only one thought remained. He had to get Rex back, but first, he had to clear his name. A glimmer of hope a week had passed since the devastating reunion with Rex. The trial was nearing its final verdict, and his attorney had little hope left. "They have the evidence stacked against you," she admitted. "And without a witness to prove otherwise." She sighed, closing her folder. "I need you to prepare for the possibility that..." "No." Jack's voice was firm, unshaken. "We still have Rex." His attorney frowned. "Jack, I know how much he means to you, but he's just a dog. He can't testify." Jack shook his head. "No, but he saw what happened that night. He was there." And if I can get through to him, I know he can prove the truth. She hesitated. Even if that were true, how do you plan to undo months of retraining? Jack leaned forward, his voice low and filled with conviction. I need one. More chance with him. The plan to reconnect it took some pulling of strings, but Jack's lawyer managed to arrange another meeting, this time under the pretense of reviewing Rex's performance as evidence. Jack knew it was his last shot. They brought him to the same sterile training facility as before. His heart pounded as the handler led Rex into the room. The dog looked just as disciplined, just as distant. Jack clenched his jaw. He had to get through to him. This time, there were no distractions. No courtroom, no judge, no chains keeping them. Apart. Just Jack and Rex. Jack knelt on the floor, meeting the dog's empty gaze. You remember me, he said softly. No reaction. Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out the small frayed cloth again, the last piece of his old uniform. He placed it on the floor between them. Rex's ears twitched, Jack noticed. It was subtle, but it was there. A crack in the wall that had been built between them. Jack slowly reached for another familiar trigger. His voice. You always hated being called a good boy, remember? Jack chuckled weakly. You weren't just a good boy. You were a damn warrior, the best partner I ever had. Rex's nostrils flared, his body tensing for a moment. Jack swallowed hard. He needed to push further. He tapped his fingers against the floor in a familiar rhythm, the same pattern he used to drum against the dashboard when they were out on patrol. It was an old habit, one that had always calmed Rex down after a long shift, thump, 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 silence. Then, a flicker of recognition. Rex's ears twitched again. His tail gave the tiniest, almost imperceptible movement. Jack's chest tightened. You do remember. But just as quickly as the moment appeared, it was gone. Rex took a step back, his training kicking in like a locked door slamming shut. The handler smirked. You see? He's not your dog anymore. Jack gritted his teeth. Maybe he had lost the battle today, but he wasn't done fighting yet. Obstacles. Mounting Jack was escorted back to his cell, but something had shifted inside him. Hope. He had seen the cracks forming in Rex's conditioning. He had seen the moment of hesitation, the flicker of something real. Rex wasn't lost. Not yet, but he needed more time. And time was running out. His trial was set to conclude in 3 days. If he didn't find a way to reach Rex before then, he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. And Rex, he would be lost forever. A desperate gamble. Jack knew he had one last move to play. The night before the final trial, Jack met with his attorney again. There's no new evidence, she admitted. The jury is leaning towards conviction. Jack nodded. He had expected that. Then, we changed the game, he said. She frowned. What do you mean? Jack took a deep breath. I want Rex in the courtroom. His attorney stared at him like he was insane. Jack, he's my partner, Jack interrupted. And I need to prove that he still remembers the truth. She hesitated. This is a gamble, she warned. If it doesn't work, Jack met her gaze. I have nothing left to lose. She exhaled, running a hand through her hair. Then finally she nodded. I'll make the request. The final test the next morning, the courtroom was packed. Jack sat at the defense table, hands clenched into fists. The judge was moments away from delivering the final verdict, and then the doors opened. Rex was led inside. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. People whispered, eyes darting between Jack and the K9. Jack barely breathed. This was it. Rex was brought to the center of the room, standing stiff beside his handler. Jack rose slowly, his movements careful. His heart was hammering so hard it echoed in his ears. Then, with every ounce of faith he had left, he whispered the one word that had always meant something to them both. Home. For a second, nothing happened. The courtroom was silent. Then, Rex's ears twitched, his tail trembled, and then, like a dam breaking, his whole body shifted, the rigid posture collapsed. His eyes flickered with something raw, something real. Then, he moved. It started with a hesitant step forward, Then another. Then the courtroom held its breath as the massive German shepherd lunged forward, straight into Jack's arms. Jack barely had time to react before Rex was on him, knocking him back with sheer force. The dog whined, a sound full of desperation, longing, and recognition. The crowd erupted. The judge slammed the gavel for silence, but the moment was too powerful to ignore. Jack buried his fingers in Rex's fur, his throat tight. "That's my boy," he choked out. The handler tried to call him back, but Rex ignored him completely. He had made his choice, and the jury had just witnessed it firsthand. Jack looked up, meeting the prosecutor's stunned expression. "This dog doesn't lie," Jack said, voice steady. "And he just proved that everything they told you about me was a lie," the jury murmured. The judge leaned forward. "I want to hear more about this," he said, his tone serious. "Right now." Jack exhaled, gripping Rex tightly. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had just turned. The trial turns. The moment was electric. The courtroom, once filled with whispers of doubt and certainty of Jack's conviction, had fallen into stunned silence. Rex, once cold, distant, and conditioned into forgetting his past, had broken free. The massive German shepherd, his fur still stiff from training, but his eyes now burning with emotion, refused to move from Jack's side. His paws pressed firmly against Jack's chest, as if reassuring himself that his partner was truly there. Jack held him tight, his throat constricting. "I never stopped believing in you," he whispered. "Not for a second." But the battle wasn't over yet. The judge's gavel came down hard, snapping everyone back into reality. "Order in the court!" Rex flinched but didn't move from Jack's embrace. Jack slowly stood, his arms still steadying the dog. The prosecutor, who had been so certain of Jack's guilt, looked rattled. "Your Honor," he started, clearing his throat. This is touching, truly, but it's still just an animal. This reaction doesn't prove anything." Jack turned to face him. His jaw was tight, but his voice was steady. "You're wrong," he said. "Rex isn't just an animal, he's a witness," the prosecutor scoffed. "A witness?" he gestured to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is an emotional display, but we need facts." Jack knelt beside Rex, gently grasping his muzzle. The dog's amber eyes locked onto his, and Jack knew this wasn't just a display. Rex knew. He remembered. Jack swallowed. Hard. He had one shot at this. The final test. Jack turned to the judge. "Your Honor, if you'll allow it, I want to show you something." The judge hesitated, then nodded. "Proceed." Jack stood and looked at Rex. "Rex, you remember what happened that night, don't you?" The dog tilted his head slightly. Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a single spent bullet casing. "This was the round fired the night of the crime," Jack said. "Rex was trained to identify scent markers on command. If I'm guilty, he should react to me." The courtroom watched in hushed anticipation. Jack held up the casing. "Rex, track." For a heartbeat, Rex remained still. Then, the shepherd's nostrils flared. His ears perked. His training took over. He lowered his snout, inhaling deeply, processing the scent imprinted on the metal. Then, Rex turned, not towards Jack, but towards the prosecutor's table. Gasps erupted as the dog took slow, deliberate steps forward. The prosecutor stiffened. This means nothing. It's a coincidence." Jack didn't move. His pulse pounded in his ears. "Rex," he said firmly. "Confirm." Rex's lips curled. A low, guttural growl rumbled from deep within his chest. His eyes locked onto a man standing near the prosecutor, a detective, the same detective who had investigated Jack's case. The color drained from the man's face, and in that moment, the entire courtroom knew Jack hadn't been the guilty one. The truth comes. Out panic rippled through the prosecutor's table. The detective, the same one who had conveniently found evidence against Jack, shifted uncomfortably. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Langley," he addressed the detective, "you seem nervous. Is there something you'd like to share?" "With the court," Langley stammered. This is ridiculous. It's just a dog's reaction. It doesn't—" Jack's lawyer seized the moment. "Your Honor, I'd like to request an immediate review of Detective Langley's involvement. In this case, if Rex tracked the gunpowder residue to him, then it's possible the real evidence was tampered with. Langley took a step back. His eyes darted to the door. Rex let out a sharp bark. The courtroom security guards tensed. Jack saw it before anyone else did. Langley's hand was inching towards his hip, towards his concealed weapon. "Don't," Jack commanded. Before Langley could react, Rex lunged. The dog slammed into the detective, knocking him flat. The room erupted into chaos as officers swarmed in, pinning Langley to the ground. In the scuffle, something metallic clattered onto the floor. A second bullet casing. Perfect match to the one Jack had just used. Silence. The judge rubbed his temple before turning to the prosecutor. "I think we need a full inquiry into this case." The prosecutor nodded stiffly, his face pale. I believe we do, Your Honor." The gavel slammed down. Case adjourned until further review. Mr. Carter is to be released immediately pending formal clearance. Jack barely heard the words. All he knew was that he could finally breathe again. And Rex was pressed against him, his tail wagging slowly. Jack dropped to his knees, pressing his forehead to the dog's. His voice broke. "You saved me, buddy," he whispered. "You never forgot me after all." Rex licked his cheek, whining softly, and for the first time in months, Jack finally felt free, a second chance. The following days passed in a blur. Langley was arrested. The case was reopened, and Jack was officially exonerated. But none of it mattered as much as the fact that Rex was coming home. Jack stood outside the police kennel, watching as they unlatched Rex's enclosure for the last time. The dog didn't hesitate. The second the gate opened, he bolted straight to Jack. Jack caught him, stumbling back as Rex's front paws hit his chest. He laughed, a real full laugh for the first time in a long time. "Guess you don't need retraining after all," Jack murmured, running his fingers through Rex's fur. Rex huffed, tail wagging hard. Jack inhaled deeply. Looking up at the open sky, they had been through hell, but they had made it out. Together. And no one, no force in the world, was ever going to separate them again. A new beginning. The morning air was crisp as Jack stepped onto his porch, a fresh cup of coffee in hand. The world felt different now, lighter, freer. For months he had lived under a cloud of doubt and injustice, his reputation shattered, his life stolen. But today he was a free man, and he wasn't alone. Rex lay at Jack's feet, his massive frame stretched across the wooden boards of the porch. His ears twitched as he listened to the rustling leaves, but his eyes never strayed far from Jack. "You sticking close, huh?" Jack murmured, reaching down to scratch behind Rex's ears. The dog let out a deep, contented sigh, nudging Jack's hand as if to say, "I'll never leave your side again." Jack chuckled softly. "Yeah, buddy. I missed you too." For weeks after the trial, life had been a whirlwind. The truth about Detective Langley had sent shockwaves through the police department. An internal investigation uncovered years of corruption, and one by one those responsible were brought to justice. Jack had been offered his badge back, but he had turned it down. He had spent years dedicating his life to law enforcement, believing in a system that ultimately betrayed him. Now he wanted something different, something that didn't require a uniform or orders, something that meant something more, and it had everything to do with the dog sitting beside him. Healing wounds. The transition hadn't been easy. Rex was still adjusting. Years of police training didn't just disappear overnight. At first, he would still wake at dawn, waiting for commands that never came. His instincts remained sharp, his body tense as if expecting a mission to begin at any moment. But Jack was patient. Day by day, he worked with Rex, not as an officer and his K9 partner, but as two souls healing from a shared trauma. They went on long hikes through the mountains, far away from sirens and flashing lights. Jack threw sticks instead of issuing commands, and slowly Rex learned to play instead of work. At night, when the echoes of their past felt too heavy, Jack would sit on the floor beside Rex's bed, running his fingers through his fur, whispering stories about the good times, and Rex, He would listen, because he understood. They were both survivors, and survivors don't forget. A visit to the department one afternoon, Jack decided to visit the precinct one last time. Not for revenge, not for closure, but for Rex. Word of their reunion had spread, and the officers who had once doubted Jack now watched with quiet admiration as he walked into the department, Rex proudly trotting beside him. Chief Reynolds, the man who had once arrested Jack, stood waiting. His expression was unreadable, but Jack saw something in his eyes. Regret. "You look good, Carter," Reynolds said gruffly. Jack smirked. "You look older." The chief let out a tired chuckle. "Yeah, well, that's what happens when your best detective turns out to be a criminal." His gaze shifted to Rex. "And your best K9 proves he's smarter than the lot of us." Jack knelt beside Rex, giving his fur a firm pat. "Told you he was special." The chief nodded. "I suppose I owe you more than an apology." Jack shrugged. "You did what you thought was right, even if you were wrong." A long silence stretched between them before Reynolds sighed. "I know you turned down the badge, but if you ever change your mind..." Jack shook his head. "I'm done with the force, Chief." He glanced down at Rex, who was staring up at him with unwavering loyalty. "But we're not done helping people." Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "And what does that mean?" Jack stood, dusting off his jeans. "It means we're starting something new. A purpose beyond the badge." Jack had spent his entire life chasing justice, first as a soldier, then as a cop. But now he realized justice wasn't just about locking up bad guys. It was about giving people a second chance, and not just people. Dogs. Like Rex, loyal, intelligent, fiercely devoted, were often discarded when their service ended. Retired K9s were left in shelters, some never finding homes, others suffering from PTSD just like their human partners. Jack had seen it firsthand, and he wasn't about to let it continue. With his savings, he bought a piece of land just outside. The city. Wide open fields, a place to run, a place to heal, a place for dogs like Rex. He called it Second Chance Ranch. Within months, the ranch became a sanctuary for retired K9s, giving them a place to transition into civilian life. Some were adopted into loving homes. Others stayed at the ranch, training for new roles. Therapy dogs, search and rescue companions, service animals for veterans. Jack worked tirelessly, rehabilitating each dog with patience and understanding, and, through it all, Rex remained by his side, the heart of the operation. The ranch became more than a shelter. It became a symbol, a testament to loyalty, redemption, and the unbreakable bond between man and dog. Full circle. One evening, Jack sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in deep oranges and purples. Rex lay beside him, his eyes half-lidded, in contentment. Jack took a deep breath, letting the cool breeze wash over him. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. He glanced down at Rex. "You know, buddy, I thought losing my badge was the worst thing that could ever happen to me." Rex's ear flicked, but he didn't move. Jack smiled. "Turns out it was the best thing." Rex let out a slow exhale, nuzzling closer. Jack reached down, gently scratching the spot behind his ear, because if that hadn't happened, we wouldn't be here. He looked out at the ranch, watching as a new recruit, a young, nervous German shepherd, took his first cautious steps into the field. One of the ranch's trainers knelt nearby, calling the dog's name softly. The pup hesitated, then slowly, tentatively wagged his tail. Jack felt something warm settle in his chest. Hope. Because even in the darkest moments, even when everything seemed lost, there was always a second chance. And sometimes that second chance came on 4 legs.